Chicago, 1925. The city was on fire with gang fights. The sound of machine guns echoing through dark streets, and newspapers shouting the names of killers and kings. But one man moved through it all without being noticed. Johnny Torrio, the Fox. He lived through 5 bullets, enemy gangs, and the chaos of Prohibition, not by using strength, but by using cold, careful intelligence. While Al Capone became the scary face everyone knew, Torrio built the plan for organized crime in the shadows. He taught the next generation of mobsters, made peace where others only saw blood, and walked away from an empire worth millions, something no one else dared to try. Few people saw him, and even fewer understood him. But every city, every crime family, every violent empire had his mark on it. This is the story of Johnny Torrio, the man who changed the rules of the American underworld and lived to see his methods last for decades after he was gone. Before we jump into Johnny's amazing journey, I want to know where in the world you are watching from right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. And what time is it where you are? Are you relaxing for the night or just beginning your day? If you like deep dives into true crime history and stories that help you unwind, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And if you're already feeling curious about Johnny Torrio's story, give this video a like. Your support helps us bring you more fascinating stories like this one. Now, let's travel back to 1882 to a small Italian village where our story begins. The story starts not in the tough streets of New York or the violent roads of Chicago, but in the old Italian village of Orsara, located in the Basilicata region of southern Italy. On January 20th, 1882, Maria Carluccio gave birth to a son she and her husband Tommaso named Giovanni Donato Torrio. The family was poor, like most in that hard land, where centuries of rule by foreigners and unfair economic practices had left the people struggling to survive. Little Giovanni would know his father for only 2 years. Tommaso Torrio died when his son was barely a toddler, leaving Maria Carluccio a widow with a young child and few chances in a place that offered little opportunity. Like millions of other Italians during that time, Maria made a choice that would change history. She would take her son to America in 1884. When Giovanni was just 2 years old, Maria Carluccio packed up her belongings and her child and made the hard journey across the Atlantic Ocean. The trip itself was a challenge. Weeks packed in steerage with hundreds of other immigrants. The air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness. A constant rocking of the sea making everyone sick. But Maria pushed through, keeping her eyes fixed on the hope of America. When their ship finally sailed into New York Harbor, and Maria saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time, she cried like so many immigrants before and after her. She thought she was seeing the door to a better life. The truth, as she would soon find out, was much more difficult. The processing at Ellis Island was confusing. Officials yelling in languages she didn't understand, medical checks, endless questions. Her son's name was written down as Johnny instead of Giovanni, an American change that would stay with him for the rest of his life. From Ellis Island, they made their way to Manhattan's Lower East Side, where a small Italian community had started. The Lower East Side in the 1880s was a place of poverty, crime, and hopelessness. Tenement buildings rose like dark cliffs, blocking out the sun and trapping the smells of too many people living in too little space. Trash rotted in the streets. Sickness was everywhere. Violence was common. This was the world where Johnny Torrio would grow up. Maria did what she had to do to survive. She took in sewing, worked as a laundress, and eventually married again. this time to a man who ran what looked like a grocery store on the ground floor of one of the countless tenements. The store sold groceries, for sure, but its real business was as a cover for selling illegal alcohol to drinkers who couldn't afford or didn't want to go to regular bars. This stepfather, whose name has been lost to history, gave young Johnny his first real lessons in the basics of organized crime. The importance of having a legal front, the value of political connections, and the need to keep law enforcement away through careful bribery and threats. Johnny Torrio's childhood in the Lower East Side during the 1890s gave him an education no school could provide. The neighborhood, especially the famous 5 Points area, was a testing ground for human weakness and violence. Irish gangs, Italian gangs, Jewish gangs, all fought for control of the same desperate streets, battling over territory that included gambling dens, illegal bars, brothels, and protection schemes. Young Johnny worked in his stepfather's store from a young age, and the experience taught him lessons he would never forget. He watched how his stepfather paid off the local beat cops to ignore what was happening. He saw how successful the place was, exactly because it kept up the appearance of being legal. The grocery cover allowed customers to come and go without causing too much notice. He noticed how the same politicians who spoke out against vice in public were happy to accept envelopes of cash in private. But more importantly, Johnny watched people, even as a boy. He had an unusual talent for reading human nature. He could tell who would become violent when drunk and who would stay calm. He knew which customers could be trusted and which would tell the police at the first sign of trouble. He learned to spot undercover detectives by their shoes and their eyes. These were abilities that would help him greatly in the years ahead. As he got into his teenage years, Johnny started working as a porter, delivering packages and running errands around the neighborhood. This gave him a close knowledge of the area's layout and power structure. He learned which blocks belonged to which gangs, where the police were most active, and where the most profitable illegal operations were located. Even though Johnny Torrio was small, standing around 5'4", he had plenty of courage. More importantly, he had something rarer, intelligence. While other boys his age settled arguments with fists and knives, Johnny preferred to use his mind. He understood that violence was sometimes needed, but it was costly, attracted unwanted notice, and often solved nothing. Better to find ways to avoid conflict altogether, or to make sure that when violence was needed, it was carefully planned and carried out. By his late teens, Johnny Torrio had put together his own street group, the James Street Gang, named after the street where they were based. It was different from most youth gangs of the time. While other gangs spent their time in street fights and small thefts, Torrio's gang focused on making money. His fellow gang members called him Terrible Johnny, but the nickname was ironic. He wasn't terrible in the sense of being fearsome or physically intimidating. At 5'12" and thin, he would never scare anyone based on his body alone. Instead, the nickname showed his cold, planned approach to crime. When Johnny Torrio decided someone needed to be hurt or killed, it was done with the same lack of feeling as a businessman closing a bad account. What really set Torrio apart from other young gang leaders was his business sense. While his friends spent their stolen money on alcohol and women, Torrio saved his money, and when he had saved enough, he made a move that showed amazing forward thinking. He opened a pool hall on the surface. The pool hall was a legal business where men could play pool, hang out, and maybe make small bets on games. But in truth, it served many purposes. It was headquarters for the James Street Gang. It was a cover for gambling operations that went far beyond simple pool bets. It was a place where loan sharks could do business, and it gave Torrio something priceless. A legal source of income that he could point to if questioned by the police. The pool hall showed several ideas that would guide Torrio throughout his criminal life. First, always keep legal businesses as covers for illegal operations. Second, avoid unnecessary notice from law enforcement. Third, put illegal profits into projects that could create legal income. These weren't new ideas. Other criminals had used similar methods. But Torrio's organized use of these ideas at such a young age marked him as special. The turning point in Johnny Torrio's young life came around 1905 when he caught the attention of Paul Kelly, the leader of New York's most powerful criminal organization, the 5 Points Gang. Paul Kelly was born Paolo Vaccarelli, the son of Italian immigrants, but unlike most gangsters of his time, Kelly understood the value of fitting in and looking good. He had taken an Irish-sounding name to blend in better with the power structures of New York, where Tammany Hall politicians and Irish street gangs still held considerable control. Kelly dressed perfectly, spoke with polish, and acted more like a businessman than a thug, though he was fully capable of violence when needed. Kelly controlled a huge criminal empire covering gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering, opium dealing, and political corruption. His headquarters was the new Brighton Athletic Club, supposedly a boxing gym and social club, but in truth, the control center for his operations. When Kelly met the young Johnny Torrio, he saw something of himself in this small Italian with a sharp mind. Kelly offered Torrio a position in his organization, and Torrio accepted immediately, understanding that this was a chance to learn from the best. Under Kelly's guidance, Torrio improved his approach to criminal business. Kelly taught him the importance of appearance. Always dress well, always be groomed, always speak properly. Kelly rarely cursed, and he insisted his leaders do the same. This wasn't about being fancy. It was strategy. The better you presented yourself, the easier it was to corrupt police, politicians, and judges. They found it easier to take money from someone who looked respectable than from an obvious thug. Kelly also stressed the importance of variety. Never rely on a single source of income. Run multiple operations at the same time. If the police crack down on one, the others can keep the organization going until the heat dies down. Most importantly, Kelly taught Torrio about the value of organization. The 5 Points Gang wasn't just a collection of street toughs. It was structured almost like a company with Kelly at the top, trusted leaders below him, and various crews reporting to those leaders. Each crew had specific jobs and territory. Arguments were settled through Kelly's judgment, not random street fights. This organizational setup reduced internal conflict and maximized profit. Torrio soaked up these lessons eagerly. He worked his way up through Kelly's organization, eventually becoming one of his most trusted leaders. Torrio ran various rackets, including numbers running, bookmaking, loan sharking, and prostitution. He showed a talent for keeping operations running smoothly, avoiding police notice, and maximizing profit. During his time with Paul Kelly's organization, Johnny Torrio met a teenager who would become the most famous gangster in American history. Alphonse Capone. Al Capone was born in Brooklyn in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents. As a boy growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Brooklyn, young Al showed two notable traits. He was physically big, even as a teenager, and he had a violent temper that could explode without warning. These traits made him valuable as muscle, but they also made him dangerous and unpredictable. Capone worked at various places controlled by Kelly's organization, including clubs in Brooklyn run by Frankie Yale, one of Kelly's associates. It was probably through these connections that Capone met Torrio, though the exact details of their first meeting have been lost to history. What is clear is that Torrio saw something in the young Capone beyond just muscle. Yes, Capone was big and scary, useful qualities in the underworld. But Torrio recognized that underneath the boldness and violence, Capone had a sharp mind and real ambition. More importantly, Capone respected Torrio with an almost childlike loyalty. He called Torrio the Fox and looked for his approval in everything. For Torrio, who had no children of his own, Capone became a kind of replacement son. He took Capone under his wing, teaching him everything Paul Kelly had taught him. Dress well, speak properly, keep legal fronts, think before acting, use violence when necessary, but always as a last choice, not a first reaction. The relationship between Torrio and Capone would shape both their lives. Torrio would give Capone opportunity and guidance. Capone would give Torrio loyalty and strength. Together, they would build an empire, but their different natures, Torrio's cold calculation versus Capone's hot temper, would also plant the seeds of that empire's later change from Torrio's organized, low-profile operation into Capone's violent, attention-getting show. By 1909, Johnny Torrio had learned everything Paul Kelly could teach him and was ready to branch out on his own. With Kelly's blessing, Kelly understood that ambitious leaders who weren't given room to grow might eventually become problems. Torrio formed his own organization operating mostly in Brooklyn. Torrio's Brooklyn operations focused heavily on the waterfront, where endless chances for profit existed. The docks were controlled by various gangs who took payments from shipping companies. Dock workers and warehouse operators, Torrio moved into this territory carefully, making alliances where possible and using force only when needed. He also kept running the kinds of businesses he had learned from Kelly: gambling houses, loan sharking operations, and brothels. But Torrio was always careful to keep legal businesses as well. He invested in bars, pool halls, and other places that could operate legally while serving as covers for illegal activities. During these years, Torrio married Anna Jacobs, a Jewish woman, an unusual choice for an Italian gangster in that time, showing Torrio's willingness to cross ethnic lines when others stayed strictly within their own group. Anna would stay with him for the rest of his life, a faithful partner who asked few questions about her husband's business. Torrio was building wealth and reputation, but he was still working in the shadow of New York's more established gangs. What he needed was a chance to step into the spotlight, or rather, given his preference for staying in the shadows, a chance to control something big while staying personally unknown. That chance would come from an unexpected source: family. In 1909, Johnny Torrio got a call that would change his life. The call came from his aunt, Victoria Moresco, who had married a man named James Colosimo in Chicago, and James Big Jim Colosimo had a very serious problem. Big Jim Colosimo was one of Chicago's most successful vice lords. Starting as a street sweeper and working his way up through the city's political machine, Colosimo had built an empire of brothels, over 100 of them spread throughout Chicago's red light district known as the Levee. He also ran numerous gambling operations and had deep ties to Chicago's First Ward political bosses: Bath House, John Coughlin, and Michael Hinky Dink Kenna. Colosimo had money, power, and political protection. But he had a problem that money and political connections couldn't solve: the Black Hand. The Black Hand wasn't a single organization, but rather a type of blackmail practiced by various Italian criminals against successful Italian businessmen. The method was simple and terrifying. Victims would get letters demanding money, usually signed with a Black Hand print The letters would threaten death or violence if the money wasn't paid. And these weren't empty threats. Blackhand extortionists had proven willing to bomb businesses, kidnap family members, and murder those who refused to pay. Colosimo had received several Blackhand letters demanding larger and larger sums of money. He had paid at first, but the demands kept growing. He realized that paying would never end. The extortionists would drain him dry. But refusing to pay might get him killed. As successful as he was, Colosimo didn't have the kind of muscle or toughness needed to deal with Blackhand extortionists. So he called his wife's nephew, a young gangster from New York, who had a reputation for intelligence and ruthlessness, Johnny Torrio. Johnny Torrio arrived in Chicago in 1909, looked at the situation, and came up with a plan. The Blackhand extortionists had demanded that Colosimo deliver a payment at a specific spot. Torrio convinced Colosimo to agree to the meeting. When the extortionists arrived to collect their money, they found not a scared victim, but Johnny Torrio and several armed men waiting for them. The attack was quick and brutal. The extortionists were killed, their bodies gotten rid of, and the Blackhand threat to Colosimo ended as suddenly as it had begun. Word spread quickly through Chicago's criminal underworld. Big Jim Colosimo had brought in a fixer from New York, and that fixer didn't negotiate with extortionists. He got rid of them. It was exactly the kind of reputation Torrio wanted to build. Colosimo was impressed and grateful. He asked Torrio to stay in Chicago and help run his operations. Torrio agreed, seeing opportunity in Chicago that New York couldn't offer. By 1914, Torrio had become Colosimo's underboss, handling day-to-day operations of the empire, while Colosimo played the role of respected businessman and political fixer. Under Torrio's management, Colosimo's operations became more organized and profitable. Torrio set up a system for collecting payments from the brothels, improved security, and cut costs. He also expanded into new rackets, including gambling and loan sharking operations that Colosimo had previously ignored. But Torrio was also getting ready for the future. He studied Chicago's criminal landscape, noting the various gangs and power players. He built relationships with politicians, police chiefs, and judges. He spotted chances for growth, and he waited for his moment. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, banning the making, sale, and transport of alcoholic drinks. The Volstead Act, passed to enforce the amendment, made it illegal to produce, import, or sell alcohol with more than 5% alcohol content. Most Americans viewed Prohibition with varying amounts of doubt or open dislike. But for Johnny Torrio, Prohibition was like Christmas morning. He immediately saw what many others missed. Prohibition hadn't removed the desire for alcohol. It had simply made that desire illegal. Anyone who could provide alcohol would make a fortune. Torrio went to Colosimo with his idea. They should immediately move into bootlegging, smuggling, making, and selling illegal alcohol. The possible profits were bigger than everything they were currently doing: prostitution, gambling, loan sharking. All would become secondary to the gold mine that was illegal alcohol, but Colosimo refused. He was comfortable with his current operations and scared of the increased law enforcement attention that bootlegging would bring. The federal government was enforcing Prohibition. This wasn't just local police who could be bribed. It was too risky. Colosimo said they should stick with what they knew. Torrio argued, he pleaded. He laid out detailed plans showing how they could reduce risk and maximize profit. But Colosimo stayed firm, and to make things worse from Torrio's view, Colosimo had recently divorced Victoria Moresco, Torrio's aunt, to marry a young singer named Dale Winter. Colosimo was in love, distracted, and not interested in growing his criminal empire. For Johnny Torrio, this created an impossible situation. The chance of a lifetime was staring him in the face, but his boss refused to take it. Torrio could leave Chicago and try to build a bootlegging operation somewhere else. But he had spent years building himself up here. He understood Chicago's criminal landscape, its political machinery, and its opportunities in ways he never could in a new city. There was only one answer to the problem, and Johnny Torrio, always the cold realist, didn't hesitate to see it clearly. James Colosimo had to die. On May 11, 1920, James Colosimo got a phone call at his home. The caller, likely Johnny Torrio himself, told Colosimo that a shipment was arriving at Colosimo's Cafe, his main restaurant at 2126 South Wabash Avenue, and that he needed to be there to oversee it personally. Colosimo arrived at the restaurant around 4 o'clock p. The lunch crowd had left, and the dinner crowd hadn't yet arrived. Leaving the restaurant nearly empty, Colosimo went in through the entryway. Heading toward the cloakroom and restaurant proper, he never made it further than the entryway. 2 shots rang out, and James Colosimo collapsed with bullets in his head and body. He died almost instantly. The murder remains officially unsolved to this day. But most historians believe the killer was Frankie Yale, the Brooklyn gangster who had ties to both Torrio and Al Capone. Yale had come to Chicago just before the murder and left shortly after. Bringing in an outside killer was smart. Yale had no personal connection to Colosimo and could leave Chicago immediately, making him hard to identify or catch. The murder investigation went nowhere. Torrio and Capone both had alibis. Yale was back in New York before police even knew to look for him. The Chicago police, many of whom were on Colosimo's payroll, had little reason to investigate too deeply. The case stayed open but inactive. Johnny Torrio took over control of Colosimo's entire empire, the brothels, the gambling houses, the political connections, the protection deals with police. All of it now belonged to him. He gave his old boss a fancy funeral, attending personally and showing appropriate sadness. Then he got to work building his bootlegging empire. It should be noted here, without making it sound cool, what this murder meant. Colosimo had been family by marriage, and he had given Torrio his chance in Chicago. But business came first for Johnny Torrio. This cold calculation, the ability to remove anyone who stood in the way of profit, even family, was part of what made Torrio successful. It was also part of what made him dangerous. With Colosimo out of the way, Torrio moved quickly to set up his bootlegging operations. He immediately sent for Al Capone, bringing him from New York to serve as his lieutenant and enforcer. Capone arrived in 1920 and went to work at the Four Deuces, Torrio's headquarters at 2222 South Wabash Avenue. The Four Deuces was typical of Torrio's operations. A seemingly legal saloon on the ground floor with a gambling den on the second floor, a brothel on the 3rd and 4th floors, and Torrio's office on the top floor. It served as both a money-making business and command center for his growing criminal empire. Torrio's approach to bootlegging was organized and smart. He set up multiple sources of supply, breweries. Torrio either bought existing breweries or started his own, producing beer in defiance of Prohibition. These breweries operated under the pretense of making near beer, legal beer with less than 5% alcohol content. But in truth, they made regular beer. Torrio paid off Prohibition agents, local police, and politicians to protect these operations. Distilleries, While beer was profitable, hard liquor offered better profit margins. Torrio set up illegal distilleries and also smuggled whiskey from Canada and Europe. Canadian smuggling, Canada hadn't passed Prohibition, making it a perfect source of legal alcohol that could be illegally brought into the United States. Torrio built relationships with Canadian distillers and smuggling networks that move alcohol across the border and into Chicago. Cooperation with established gangs, rather than fight existing criminal organizations for control. Torrio first worked out cooperative arrangements. He would supply alcohol to various gangs, who would sell it in their territories and split the profits. This reduced violence and police attention while maximizing profit. The money came flooding in. Prohibition-era Chicago was a city that loved to drink. And with legal alcohol unavailable, illegal alcohol brought top prices. Torrio's organization was soon making more money per week from bootlegging than it had previously made in a year from prostitution and gambling combined. By 1922, Johnny Torrio controlled the Chicago outfit. As his organization became known, but Chicago's criminal landscape remained divided. Many gangs operated throughout the city, often coming into violent conflict over territory and profits. Torrio saw this violence as wasteful and dangerous. Every time gangsters shot each other in the streets, it drew police attention. Every gang war brought newspaper headlines and public anger, which led to political pressure for crackdowns. Violence was costly in terms of both money and freedom. Torrio proposed something new: organization. He called a meeting of Chicago's major gang leaders and suggested they divide the city into territories. Each gang would control specific areas and would respect the borders of other gangs. They would form a group for bootlegging, combining resources and sharing profits according to agreed percentages. The benefits were clear: no more wasteful gang wars, reduced police attention, better efficiency in production and smuggling, shared information about law enforcement efforts, combined political influence. Many of the gang leaders agreed. Torrio's group included the Chicago outfit, Torrio and Capone controlling the South Side and much of the Loop downtown business district. The North Side gang, Dean O'Banion, controlling the North Side with a mix of Irish, Italian, and Polish members, the Jenna brothers. 6 Jenna brothers controlling Little Italy on the near West Side. Various smaller gangs controlling neighborhoods in the suburbs and outlying areas. The system worked remarkably well. For a time, Chicago enjoyed relative peace in the bootlegging underworld. The gangs made money hand over fist, and Johnny Torrio established himself as something new, the chairman of the board for organized crime in Chicago. But the peace wouldn't last. Human nature, ego, and the violence built into criminal business would eventually break Torrio's carefully built group. The man who would destroy it was Dean O'Banion, leader of the North Side gang. Dean O'Banion was everything Johnny Torrio was not. Torrio was quiet, calculating, and diplomatic. O'Banion was loud, impulsive, and violent. Torrio avoided unnecessary risks. O'Banion seemed to look for danger for its own sake, where Torrio saw business. O'Banion saw chance for both profit and excitement. O'Banion's North Side gang controlled some of Chicago's richest neighborhoods, which meant their territory included many wealthy customers willing to pay top prices for good alcohol. This made the North Side gang very profitable, and O'Banion very confident, maybe too confident. The first signs of trouble came when the Jenna brothers began selling their alcohol in North Side territory. The Jennas ran an interesting operation. They supplied hundreds of Sicilian immigrants with stills, yeast, and sugar, turning them into small-scale distillers. The Jennas would then buy the alcohol these home distillers made, water it down with other chemicals, and sell it cheaply throughout the city. This cheap liquor was lower quality than the good alcohol O'Banion sold, but it was much cheaper when the Jennas started selling in Northside territory. O'Banion complained to Torrio. After all, the group agreement specified territory divisions, but Torrio was in a tough spot. The Jennas were useful to him, and their cheap alcohol filled market demand that O'Banion's higher-priced product didn't meet. Torrio tried to mediate, but in the end he sided with the Jennas, telling O'Banion that the Jennas could sell wherever they found customers. This dismissive response angered O'Banion. He had followed Torrio's group rules, and now Torrio was changing those rules to help the Jennas at O'Banion's expense. O'Banion began planning his revenge. And being O'Banion, he planned something bold. Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, and Dean O'Banion jointly owned a brewery called the Sebin Brewery. It was one of the most profitable breweries in Chicago, producing large amounts of high-quality beer. In May 1924, O'Banion approached Torrio with a proposal. He wanted to retire from bootlegging and go back to running his flower shop. O'Banion had kept a legal flower shop throughout his criminal career and truly enjoyed the work. He would sell his share of the Sebin Brewery to Torrio and Capone for $500,000. Torrio was surprised, but pleased. He and O'Banion had been having tensions, and O'Banion's retirement would solve many problems. Torrio agreed to the deal. On May 19, 1924, Torrio, Capone, and O'Banion were to meet at the Sebin Brewery to finalize the deal and transfer ownership. When they arrived at the brewery, they found it operating as usual, with trucks being loaded with beer for distribution. As the three men discussed the final details of the sale, federal Prohibition agents suddenly raided the brewery. Torrio, Capone, and O'Banion were all arrested, along with many employees. It was then that Torrio realized he had been brilliantly double-crossed. O'Banion had known the raid was coming. He had likely arranged it himself through corrupt federal agents, who then leaked the information to him. He had sold his share of the brewery to Torrio and Capone just hours before the raid, making sure he got his money while they took the criminal penalties. The consequences were serious. All three were charged with breaking the Volstead Act. But because this was O'Banion's first offense, he received a light sentence. Torrio and Capone, with past convictions, faced much tougher penalties. Torrio was sentenced to 9 months in jail and a $5,000 fine. Johnny Torrio was not a man who accepted betrayal lightly. O'Banion had made a fool of him, cost him money, and damaged his reputation. The coldly calculating Torrio looked at the situation and reached a conclusion. Dean O'Banion had to die. The hit on Dean O'Banion was arranged for November 10, 1924. The location was perfect. O'Banion's own flower shop at 738 North State Street, right in the heart of his own territory, where he felt completely safe. Mike Merlo, president of the Union Siciliana, a group that served as a front for mob activities, had died on November 8th. Torrio, Capone, and other mob leaders all ordered fancy flower arrangements for the funeral, and these orders were placed with O'Banion's flower shop. This gave the hitman a perfect excuse to visit the shop. On the morning of November 10th, 3 men entered the flower shop. O'Banion recognized them and wasn't alarmed. They were fellow gangsters coming to talk about flower arrangements for Merlot's funeral. O'Banion reached out to shake hands with the first man. The man grabbed O'Banion's hand and held it, stopping him from reaching for his gun. The other 2 men pulled out pistols and opened fire. O'Banion was hit 6 times and died almost instantly. The 3 killers walked out of the shop calmly and drove away. No one was ever convicted of the murder, though most historians believe the killers were John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, working on orders from Torrio and with permission from the Jenna brothers and other mob leaders who had grown tired of O'Banion's unpredictability. O'Banion got a big funeral attended by thousands of mourners and many gangsters, including Johnny Torrio and Al Capone. They stood at O'Banion's casket, paying their respects to the man they had ordered killed. It was pure theater and typical of the dishonesty that filled the underworld. But if Torrio thought O'Banion's death would end his problems with the North Side gang, he was badly mistaken. O'Banion's lieutenants, particularly Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, were determined to get revenge for their boss, and Johnny Torrio, the man who had always relied on intelligence rather than violence, was about to learn that sometimes violence finds you, no matter how carefully you plan. January 24th, 1925, was a cold Saturday afternoon in Chicago. Johnny Torrio and his wife Anna had been out shopping, and at about 4:30 p.m., their chauffeur-driven car pulled up in front of their apartment building at 7113 South Clyde Avenue. Torrio was carrying grocery bags and packages from their shopping trip. His chauffeur, who has been identified as either Robert Barton or Sylvester Barton in different accounts, was helping unload the car. Anna was walking toward the building entrance. It seemed like an ordinary domestic scene, the kind of everyday moment that had nothing to do with bootlegging empires or gang wars. Then a blue Cadillac pulled up behind Torrio's car. 2 men got out of the Cadillac, Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, 2 of Dean O'Banion's most loyal lieutenants. They had been waiting for exactly this chance, catching Torrio outside his home, without bodyguards, vulnerable. The first shots hit Torrio's chauffeur in the leg, dropping him to the ground. Torrio, despite his lack of physical strength, was no coward. He dropped his packages and reached for the gun he carried, but he was too slow. The next bullet hit Torrio in the jaw, breaking bone and teeth. Another bullet tore through his right arm. A third bullet punctured his lung. A fourth bullet hit his groin. A fifth bullet struck his abdomen. Johnny Torrio, the man who had built an empire through intelligence and careful planning, collapsed onto the cold sidewalk in a spreading pool of his own blood. He lay completely still, not moving, barely breathing. Jaime Weiss approached the fallen gangster. Standing over him with his gun raised, Moran urged him to finish the job, to put a final bullet in Torrio's head and make sure he was dead. Weiss pulled the trigger. The gun clicked empty. In a moment that would define the rest of Johnny Torrio's life, Jaime Weiss had run out of ammunition rather than reload, a process that would only take seconds. Weiss and Moran panicked. They had just shot a man 5 times in broad daylight on a residential street. Neighbors were looking out windows. Someone might have called the police. They ran back to their Cadillac and sped away, leaving Torrio bleeding on the sidewalk. Anna screamed for help. The wounded chauffeur crawled to a nearby house and pounded on the door, yelling for someone to call an ambulance. Neighbors came out of their homes, shocked at the scene of violence on their peaceful street. Johnny Torrio stayed conscious through it all. As he lay there, bleeding from 5 different wounds, the incredibly tough little gangster kept his mind clear enough to understand what had happened. Dean O'Banion's men had come for revenge, and they had very nearly succeeded. The ambulance rushed Torrio to Jackson Park Hospital. Doctors worked frantically to save his life, operating immediately on the most serious wounds. The bullet in his jaw required major surgery. The lung wound was life-threatening. The stomach wound could easily get infected and kill him. The groin wound was painful and dangerous. The arm wound was the least serious, but still required surgery. Against all odds, Johnny Torrio survived. His small body worked in his favor. The bullets had less body mass to travel through, which meant some of them had passed through without hitting vital organs. But the recovery would be long and painful. While Torrio lay in his hospital bed, Al Capone took control of the organization. Capone immediately stepped up the gang war with the North Side Gang, launching attacks against Weiss, Moran, and their associates. The streets of Chicago exploded in violence. The careful peace that Torrio had built through his bootlegging group shattered completely. But Torrio was also facing legal problems that came before his shooting. The arrest at the Sebin Brewery, O'Banion's final gift, had resulted in Torrio's conviction for breaking the Volstead Act. He had been sentenced to 9 months in jail, but the sentence had been delayed while he appealed. The appeals had failed. When Torrio recovered from his wounds, he would have to serve his time. As Torrio lay in his hospital bed, recovering slowly from his wounds, he had time to think. More time than he'd had in years. The man who had always been moving, always planning, always building, was forced into stillness and thought. What he thought about changed everything. Johnny Torrio was 43 years old. He had survived poverty, street gang wars, Black Hand extortionists, and now 5 bullets. He had built a bootlegging empire worth millions of dollars. He had wealth, power, and influence beyond anything that young Giovanni from Orsara could have imagined. But lying in that hospital bed, feeling the pain from his wounds, Torrio had to face an unpleasant truth. Violence had always been part of his world, but he had managed to shield himself from it. He gave orders, others carried them out. He made decisions, others faced the results. He had believed his intelligence made him safe from the random brutality that claimed so many gangsters. The 5 bullets proved otherwise. For the first time in his criminal career, Johnny Torrio seriously thought about something almost unthinkable for a man at the peak of his power. Retirement in April 1925, having recovered enough from his wounds. Johnny Torrio reported to the Lake County Jail in Waukegan, Illinois, to begin serving his 9-month sentence for the Sebin Brewery conviction. He was placed in protective custody. Prison officials knew that the leader of the Chicago outfit would be a target for revenge killings. If put in the general population, the time in jail gave Torrio even more chance for reflection. Through newspapers and visits from associates, he followed events in Chicago. The gang war between the Chicago outfit and the North Side Gang continued to rage. Men were dying on both sides. The Jenna Brothers organization was falling apart. 3 of the 6 brothers were killed in quick succession in 1925. The violence was drawing more law enforcement and media attention than ever before. Al Capone was thriving in the spotlight, where Torrio had always preferred to stay unknown. Capone welcomed publicity. He gave interviews to reporters, built an image as a modern-day Robin Hood, and seemed to enjoy being famous. The newspapers called him Scarface because of the knife scars on his face from his youth. Capone was becoming the face of Chicago organized crime, exactly what Torrio had always avoided. But Capone was also making the organization more money than ever. His aggressive tactics were getting new territory. His willingness to use overwhelming violence was scaring rivals into giving up. From a purely business view, Capone's approach was working, yet Torrio could see the long-term problems. The more famous Capone became, the more pressure law enforcement would face to take action. The more violent the gang wars, the more public anger would grow. The more attention the Chicago outfit drew, the more dangerous it became for everyone involved. Torrio had built an empire, but keeping that empire required constant watch, constant risk, and an acceptance that violence could reach him at any moment. Those 5 bullets had taught him that no amount of planning, no amount of intelligence could fully protect him. In the underworld, death was always one mistake, one betrayal, one moment of bad luck away. As his release date approached, Johnny Torrio made his choice. It was a choice that would shock the underworld and show the quality that truly set him apart from his peers. The wisdom to know when to quit. In October 1925, Johnny Torrio was released from jail. He came out to find Al Capone firmly in charge of daily operations. The gang war with the North Side gang still raging, and his empire more profitable than ever, but also more dangerous than ever. Torrio called a meeting with Capone and a few of his most trusted associates. What he said at that meeting stunned everyone there. He was retiring. He was leaving Chicago. He was handing over complete control of the entire Chicago outfit. All the breweries, distilleries, brothels, gambling houses, political connections, everything to Al Capone. Capone was shocked. At just 26 years old, he was being given control of an empire worth tens of millions of dollars. But he was also worried. Was this really retirement? Or was Torrio somehow testing him? Would Torrio eventually return and expect to take back control? Torrio assured him it was real. The shooting had changed him. He was tired of looking over his shoulder. He wanted to spend time with his wife and mother, to travel, to enjoy the wealth he had built while he still could. He would be available to offer advice if Capone wanted it. But the empire was now Capone's to run as he saw fit. This moment is perhaps more remarkable than any other in Johnny Torrio's life. In the underworld, power was not freely given up. Mob bosses retired in one of 3 ways. They died, they went to prison, or they were forced out by ambitious underlings. The idea of a boss at the height of his power simply walking away was almost unheard of. But Torrio understood something his peers didn't. There was no long-term winning in the gang war business. You could be successful, even dominant, but eventually violence would find you, or the law would catch you, or a subordinate would betray you. The only way to truly win was to leave the game while you were ahead. He gathered his wife, Anna, and his mother, Maria, now elderly, but still alive. In November 1925, the 3 of them got on a ship and sailed for Italy. Johnny Torrio was going home to the country he had left as a 2-year-old child, now returning as a wealthy man in his 40s. As the ship pulled away from New York Harbor, Torrio stood on deck and watched America disappear into the distance. Behind him, he left an empire. Ahead of him lay an uncertain future. But he was alive, he was free, and he was out of the killing business. For Johnny Torrio, that was enough. Johnny Torrio spent the next 3 years in Italy, living quietly with his wife and mother. He settled in southern Italy, not far from the village of his birth, buying a comfortable villa with some of his built-up wealth. For a man who had spent decades in the crowded, violent streets of New York and Chicago, the peaceful Italian countryside must have seemed like a different world. But Torrio wasn't completely cut off from his old life. He read American newspapers when he could get them. He got letters from associates, and through these channels he watched as his protégé Al Capone changed the Chicago outfit from Torrio's relatively low-profile operation into the most famous criminal organization in America. Capone was making headlines constantly. His gang war with the North Side gang had become the stuff of legend. In 1926, the violence reached crazy levels, with gangsters literally driving through Chicago streets with machine guns. Shooting at rival places, Capone himself survived multiple attempts on his life, including one where his headquarters hotel was sprayed with over 1,000 rounds of machine gun fire. But Capone was also building power. By 1927, he had effectively won the gang war. The North Side Gang was broken, its leaders dead or scattered. The Chicago outfit controlled most of Chicago's bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. Capone was reportedly making huge profits by the late 1920s. Estimates vary, and the exact number is disputed. Yet, the amount of income was undeniably vast. Yet, Capone was also drawing exactly the kind of attention Torrio had always avoided. Newspapers ran constant stories about Chicago gang violence. Reformers demanded action. The federal government began paying attention. Capone had become so famous that he was a household name. But in Torrio's mind, that fame was dangerous. The violence reached its peak on February 14, 1929, when Capone's men, disguised as police officers, killed 7 members of the North Side Gang in what became known as the ST, Valentine's Day Massacre. The cruelty of the killings. The victims were lined up against a wall and machine-gunned, shocked the nation. Even Americans who had been accepting of bootleggers and gang violence were horrified. For Torrio, watching from Italy, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre confirmed his choice to retire. Capone had won the gang war, but at what cost? The whole nation was now demanding action against Chicago gangsters. The heat Capone had drawn would surely result in a law enforcement crackdown. Torrio's stay in Italy was about to be cut short by events beyond his control. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist government was building power, and one of Mussolini's goals was getting rid of the Mafia and organized crime, which he saw as a challenge to government power. Mussolini's crackdown on Italian organized crime was harsh and effective. Thousands of suspected Mafia members were arrested, imprisoned, or forced to flee for Johnny Torrio, a known American gangster living in Italy. This clearly meant problems. Italian officials started asking questions about his background and his wealth. It was only a matter of time before he would face arrest or deportation. In 1928, Johnny Torrio made the decision to return to the United States. But he didn't return to Chicago. That was Capone's city now, and Torrio had no interest in being pulled back into that world. Instead, he returned to New York, to the city where his American journey had begun. When Johnny Torrio returned to New York in 1928, he was 46 years old, wealthy, and determined to stay low-key. He and Anna settled in Brooklyn. Living quietly in a modest apartment, Torrio presented himself as a semi-retired businessman with real estate interests, which was true as far as it went. But Torrio couldn't completely leave the underworld. His reputation as an organizational genius and older advisor made him valuable to New York's rising generation of gangsters. And the timing of his return was lucky because the New York underworld was in transition. Arnold Rothstein, the financial genius who had funded many criminal operations and served as a kind of unofficial chairman for New York organized crime, was murdered in November 1928. His death created a power vacuum. Various gangs and bosses fought for position. Into this uncertain environment came Johnny Torrio, a man with unmatched experience in organizing criminal operations and settling disputes between rival groups. 2 men in particular sought Torrio's advice: Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Charles Lucky Luciano was a young Italian gangster with big dreams and a sharp mind. He had worked his way up through New York's underworld and was becoming a major power in bootlegging and narcotics. But Luciano understood that his dreams needed more than just muscle and toughness. He needed organization, planning, and the kind of strategic thinking that had made Torrio successful in Chicago. Meyer Lansky was a Jewish gangster, equally ambitious and even more intelligent than Luciano, where Luciano was the face of their partnership. Charming and bold, Lansky was the financial brain, keeping the books and planning for the long term. Lansky had read about Torrio's Chicago operation and was fascinated by his organizational methods. Together, Luciano and Lansky sought out Torrio and asked for his help. What they wanted was ambitious. They wanted to do for the whole East Coast what Torrio had done for Chicago. They wanted to organize the bootlegging rackets, remove wasteful competition, and maximize profits through cooperation rather than constant war. Torrio agreed to help. This was the kind of work he had always enjoyed. Organization, mediation, strategic planning, and importantly, it didn't require him to run any operations directly. He could serve as advisor and consultant, offering wisdom and guidance without the daily risks of active criminal business under Torrio's guidance. Luciano and Lansky created what became known as the Big Seven bootlegging syndicate. This was a group of East Coast bootlegging operations, similar to what Torrio had created in Chicago, but on a larger scale. The members of the Big Seven included Lucky Luciano, operating mostly in New York, controlling significant bootlegging and narcotics operations. Meyer Lansky, Luciano's partner, handling the financial and organizational sides of their operations. Longies Willman, New Jersey bootlegging boss, controlling operations in Newark and northern New Jersey. Joe Adonis Brooklyn boss, controlling operations in South Brooklyn and keeping important political connections. Frank Kostlow, slot machine king and political fixer with connections throughout New York's political establishment. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Luciano and Lansky's enforcer, charming and violent in equal measure. Dutch Schultz, Bronx beer baron, controlling significant bootlegging operations in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. The Big Seven operated on the principles Torrio had set up in Chicago. Territory agreements, cooperation on large smuggling operations, shared information about law enforcement activities, and settling disputes through discussion rather than immediate violence. But Torrio had a larger vision. The Big Seven was successful, but it was still regional. Torrio started pushing for something unheard of: a national organization of criminal businesses. Gangs from different cities, even different ethnic backgrounds, would cooperate in a loose alliance. They would respect each other's territories, share profitable opportunities, and present a united front against law enforcement. It was a bold idea. Traditional mobsters believed in ethnic loyalty. Italian gangsters worked with other Italians, Jewish gangsters with other Jews, Irish gangsters with other Irish. The idea of cross-ethnic cooperation was radical, and the idea of gangsters from different cities working together rather than competing when their interests overlapped was almost revolutionary. But Torrio had shown in Chicago that cooperation was more profitable than competition, and he had Luciano and Lansky as supporters, too young. Ambitious gangsters who understood that the old ways of doing business were limiting their potential. In the spring of 1929, Torrio proposed a conference, a gathering of major gang leaders from across the country to discuss cooperation and set ground rules. The location would be Atlantic City, a resort town on the New Jersey coast. The timing would be May 1929. It would become the most important meeting in the history of American organized crime. The Atlantic City Conference took place from May 13th to 16th, 1929, at the President Hotel. Some accounts say the Ritz-Carlton, The official cover story was that it was a celebration of Meyer Lansky's honeymoon with his bride, Anna Citrin. In truth, it was a summit meeting of America's most powerful gangsters. The conference was hosted by Enoch "Nucky" Johnson, the Atlantic City political boss who controlled the city's bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution rackets. Johnson provided security, arranged rooms, and made sure local police wouldn't interfere. There's a bit of irony in the fact that Johnson first booked rooms at the Fancy Breakers hotel only to have the hotel refuse service when they realized the guests weren't Protestant, showing that even powerful gangsters faced ethnic and religious discrimination in 1929 America. The people there represented a who's who of American organized crime. From New York and the surrounding area, Johnny Torrio, older advisor and main organizer; Charles "Lucky" Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Kostlow, Joe Adonis, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Dutch Schultz, Louis Lech Behalter, Vincent Mangano, Frank Erickson, Albert Anastasia, Frank Scalise, Longies Willman, New Jersey, from Chicago, Al Capone, Frank Nitti from Philadelphia, Max Boo Boo Hoff from Boston, Charles King Solomon, and various representatives from other cities, including Cleveland, Kansas City, and Detroit. It's worth stopping to think about the amazing nature of this gathering. Here were men who controlled illegal empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars, men who led armies of gunmen, men who had killed rivals and corrupted politicians. Yet they were meeting not to fight, but to talk, to negotiate, to organize. Over 4 days of meetings, the conference attendees, with Johnny Torrio leading as older advisor, set up what became known as the 14 Points Agreement. While the exact details of this agreement weren't written down, it was, after all, a criminal conspiracy. Historical research and later testimony from mob informants have revealed the general outline. 1. Territory recognition. Each organization's control over its own territory would be recognized and respected by all others. No boss would try to move into another boss's city without permission. 2. National cooperation. When criminal operations crossed territory lines, such as smuggling operations, affected parties would cooperate and share profits according to agreed percentages. 3. Dispute resolution. Conflicts between organizations would be settled through discussion and mediation rather than immediate violence. A council of senior bosses would settle arguments. 4. Ethnic cooperation. The old rules about working only with your own ethnic group were dropped. Italian, Jewish, Irish, and other gangsters would work together based on business considerations, not ethnicity. 5. Prohibition partnerships. Bootlegging operations, especially large smuggling operations from Canada and Europe, would be joint efforts sharing costs and profits. 6. Political corruption. Organizations would share information about which politicians, police, and judges could be bribed and at what prices to avoid wasteful competitive bribery. 7. Violence as last resort. Murder of rivals would be avoided when possible, as it drew law enforcement attention. When violence was needed, it would be approved by the council to make sure it didn't cause wasteful gang wars. 8. Media management. Organizations would try to keep their activities out of newspapers when possible. Publicity was bad for business. 9. Getting ready for different things. Recognizing that prohibition would likely end eventually, public opinion was already changing. Organizations should start investing in other rackets: gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics, loan sharking, and legal businesses. 10. Law enforcement intelligence. Organizations would share information about federal law enforcement activities. especially about tax investigations and large-scale raids. 11. Professional standards. Members of the syndicate were expected to dress well, act professionally, and keep legal business fronts. The goal was to look respectable. 12. Tax compliance. This was Johnny Torrio's special focus. Organizations should file income tax returns and pay at least some taxes on apparent legal income. The federal government was increasingly using tax evasion as a way to prosecute gangsters who couldn't be convicted of other crimes. 13. Territory expansion. Any organization wanting to grow into new territory, a new city or region, needed to get approval from the council to prevent conflicts. 14. Internal discipline. Each boss was responsible for disciplining his own organization. Problems caused by subordinates would be handled internally when possible. This outline was revolutionary. For the first time, American organized crime was operating on a national scale with agreed-upon rules. It wasn't a strict hierarchy. Each boss still controlled his own territory independently, but it was an alliance with methods for cooperation and conflict resolution. But the Atlantic City Conference had another purpose beyond setting up the outline for national cooperation. There was a specific problem that needed to be addressed. Al Capone, the street, Valentine's Day Massacre, just 3 months earlier, had made Capone the most famous and most wanted gangster in America. President Herbert Hoover himself had reportedly demanded action against Capone. The heat Capone had drawn wasn't just affecting Chicago. It was affecting organized crime nationally. Federal law enforcement was expanding its efforts against bootlegging everywhere, partly because of the public anger over Chicago's gang violence. Johnny Torrio, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and other senior leaders recognized that Capone had become a problem. His violence had been effective in winning Chicago's gang wars, but it was now threatening everyone's operations. Something had to be done. The solution they proposed was clever. Capone would willingly get himself arrested on a minor charge. He would serve a short jail sentence, maybe a year, during which time the public anger would cool down. When he was released, he could return to Chicago with less heat on him. To Capone's credit, he understood the logic and agreed. The man who had just won complete control of Chicago's underworld would willingly go to prison to take pressure off the national syndicate. The arrest was arranged for shortly after Capone left Atlantic City. On May 17, 1929, just 1 day after the conference ended, Capone and his bodyguard were arrested in Philadelphia for carrying hidden weapons. This was normally a minor offense that might result in a fine, but the judge almost certainly bribed in advance. Sentenced Capone to 1 year in prison. Capone served his time as agreed. But when he was released in March 1930, he found that the heat hadn't lessened. It had gotten worse. Federal authorities, especially the Treasury Department's Elmer Irie, were building a tax evasion case against him. The short imprisonment hadn't solved the Capone problem. It had only delayed the unavoidable. Following the Atlantic City Conference, Torrio, Luciano, and Lansky kept developing the organizational outline they had set up. Over the next several years, through additional meetings and ongoing communication, what emerged was the National Crime Syndicate, also known simply as the Syndicate or the Commission. A national crime syndicate was made official in the early 1930s, reaching its final form around 1931 to 1934. It wasn't a single organization with a CEO at the top. Instead, it was more like a board of directors representing major criminal organizations across the country. Each boss kept control of his own territory, but major decisions, especially those affecting multiple territories, required discussion and approval from the Commission. A key meeting took place in the spring of 1934 at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Johnny Torrio led this gathering, which included representatives from New York, multiple crime families, with Lucky Luciano becoming first among equals, New Jersey, Loughees Willman, and others. Chicago outfit representatives. Capone was fighting his tax case at this time. Cleveland, the Mayfield Road Gang and the Cleveland Syndicate. New Orleans, Carlos Marcello's organization. Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno's organization. Miami, Florida operations. Various Midwestern syndicates. Minneapolis, Kid Can and Minnesota operations. Detroit, the Detroit Partnership. Kansas City, the Kansas City Mob. Los Angeles, Jack Dragna and the Los Angeles family. This Waldorf Astoria meeting made the structure of the National Crime Syndicate official. The key new idea was the creation of what became known as Murder Incorporated, an enforcement group that could carry out approved hits authorized by the Commission. This served multiple purposes. First, it provided a way to enforce the syndicate's decisions. If a boss broke agreements or became a problem, the Commission could approve his removal. Second, it made contract killing more professional. Rather than each organization keeping its own hitman, a central group of killers could be sent where needed. This was more efficient and reduced the risk of botched hits that might draw law enforcement attention. Third, and most cleverly, it protected the bosses themselves from murder charges. The bosses gave approval, but the actual killers were several steps removed in the chain of command, making it hard to prove the boss's involvement. Murder, Inc. was mostly run by Louis Lech Buhalter and Albert Anastasia. Operating out of Brooklyn, the actual killers included men like Abe Kid Twist Reels, Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, and Martin Bugsy Goldstein. These men carried out dozens, possibly hundreds of approved hits during the 1930s and 1940s. Throughout this period, Johnny Torrio kept serving as advisor and older statesman, but he firmly refused to take on operational responsibilities. He would go to meetings, offer advice, help settle disputes, but he wouldn't run any criminal operations directly. This meant he was also protected from legal trouble. When authorities investigated organized crime, they found Torrio's name mentioned often, but always in unclear terms. He was an advisor, he was consulted, but they could never prove he ordered specific crimes or ran specific operations. More importantly, Torrio's warning about income taxes proved correct. As early as 1928, even before Al Capone's tax troubles, Torrio had advised his associates to file tax returns and pay taxes on at least some of their income. He understood that the federal government had found a powerful tool. Mobsters who couldn't be convicted of murder, bootlegging, or racketeering could often be convicted of tax evasion. Many mobsters followed Torrio's advice. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others filed tax returns reporting income from gambling, consulting, or other unclear sources. They paid taxes on enough money to avoid suspicion while hiding the huge majority of their illegal income. Those who ignored Torrio's advice paid the price. Al Capone, the most famous, was convicted of tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Dutch Schultz faced tax evasion charges. Waxy Gordon was convicted of tax evasion. The list went on. The irony is that in 1936, Torrio himself was charged with tax evasion. Federal prosecutors said he had failed to pay taxes on income from the 1920s. The case dragged through the courts for years with Torrio fighting it on technical grounds. He was eventually convicted in 1939 and sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison. Torrio was 57 years old when he entered prison. He served his time quietly at Leavenworth. Keeping a low profile and avoiding trouble, he was released in 1941. Having served 2 years with time off for good behavior, this was Johnny Torrio's last major interaction with the criminal justice system. He had been shot 5 times. He had been imprisoned twice. He had built empires and walked away from them. Now, at nearly 60 years old, he was determined to truly retire. When Johnny Torrio was released from prison in 1941, he returned to Brooklyn with his wife Anna. They rented a modest apartment, far from the luxury he could have afforded, but consistent with his desire to go unnoticed. The couple lived simply, quietly, without fuss. Torrio presented himself to the world as a retired businessman with investments in real estate. And this was partly true. He had invested wisely over the years, buying properties in Brooklyn and elsewhere. These investments provided legal income that, combined with money he had hidden away during his criminal career, allowed him to live comfortably without working. Sometimes old associates would come to him for advice. Lucky Luciano, before his imprisonment and deportation, consulted with Torrio, Frank Kostlow, who became one of New York's most powerful bosses in the 1940s and 1950s. Sometimes sought Torrio's advice, Meyer Lansky. The financial genius of the mob kept in touch with Torrio throughout these years, but Torrio was mostly retired. He and Anna lived routine lives. They went shopping. They visited the same local places, the same barbershop, the same grocery store, the same restaurants. They were just another older couple in Brooklyn, remarkable only for how unremarkable they were. For a brief time in the early 1950s, around 1953, they moved to Cincinnati, Ohio for a short while before returning to Brooklyn. Though the reasons for this move aren't entirely clear. Maybe Torrio had business interests there, or maybe he just wanted a change of scenery. Either way, they eventually returned to Brooklyn, which had been their home for so long, while Johnny Torrio lived quietly in Brooklyn. Many of his old associates and protégés were dying or suffering. Al Capone, the student who had surpassed his teacher in fame, spent his final years as a broken man, released from prison in 1939 after serving 8 years. Capone was suffering from advanced syphilis that had gone untreated during his youth. The disease had destroyed his brain, leaving him with the mental ability of a 12-year-old. He lived in his Florida mansion, increasingly confused and not making sense until his death in 1947 at age 48. Johnny Torrio did not attend Capone's funeral. Dean O'Banion, whose betrayal had set in motion Torrio's retirement, had been murdered in 1924, dying at 41. The Jenna brothers, who had helped trigger the Chicago gang wars, were nearly all killed. Angelo, Mike, and Tony Jenna were murdered in 1925. The surviving brothers fled Chicago. Jaime Weiss, one of the men who shot Torrio, was killed in 1926 at 28 years old, machine-gunned outside his headquarters. Bugs Moran, Weiss's partner in shooting Torrio, survived longer but died penniless in Leavenworth Federal Prison in 1957 while serving time for bank robbery. Dutch Schultz, member of the Big Seven, was murdered in 1935 at 33. Victim of a syndicate hit after he threatened to kill prosecutor Thomas Dewey without commission approval. Bugsy Siegel, the charming enforcer who had attended Atlantic City, was murdered in 1947 at age 41, killed on commission orders for stealing from the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. Louis Lept Buhalter, who ran Murder, Inc., was executed in the electric chair in 1944 after being convicted of murder The pattern was clear. The enforcers, the violent men, the ones who welcomed publicity and violence, they died young. They were shot, electrocuted, or imprisoned. Their lives ended in violence, just as they had lived in violence. But some, like Torrio, survived. Meyer Lansky lived until 1983, dying of natural causes at age 81. Like Torrio, Lansky had been an organizer and financial mind, not an enforcer. He avoided the spotlight and focused on making money rather than headlines. Frank Kostlow lived until 1973, dying of natural causes at age 82. Kostlow had been a political fixer and diplomat among the mobs, more likely to bribe than to kill. Lucky Luciano died in 1962 at age 64 from a heart attack. Though he had been imprisoned and deported, he avoided the violent death that claimed so many of his peers. The pattern suggests something important. In the underworld, the organizers survived while the gunmen died. The men who thought strategically and avoided unnecessary violence lived long lives. The men who loved violence and publicity died young. Johnny Torrio had understood this truth earlier than most. His retirement in 1925, when he was only 43, had seemed like cowardice to some. In hindsight, it looked like wisdom. Throughout all of Torrio's criminal career and retirement, one thing stayed the same. His wife Anna, they had married young, probably around 1912, and she stayed with him through everything. The poverty, the violence, the shooting, the imprisonment, the moves, the quiet years. Historical records tell us very little about Anna Torrio. She was Jewish, from a respectable family, and by all accounts, she was devoted to her husband, despite knowing about his criminal activities. The fact that Torrio married, outside his ethnic background, an Italian marrying a Jewish woman, was unusual for that time and suggests Torrio cared little for the tribal thinking that dominated most gangsters. The Torrios had no children, at least none that appear in any historical records. Whether this was by choice, due to health issues, or for other reasons remains unknown. In some ways, Al Capone served as a replacement son for Torrio, though he would later say his real children were the criminal organizations he built. What we know is that Johnny and Anna lived simply in their Brooklyn apartment. They had a routine. Torrio would visit the same barbershop every week. They would shop at the same grocery stores. They would take walks through their neighborhood. They lived the kind of ordinary home life that would have seemed impossible during Torrio's Chicago years. Neighbors who knew them in their later years described them as a quiet, polite, older couple. Few realized they were living next to one of the most important figures in the history of American organized crime. This anonymity was exactly what Torrio wanted. Anna gave Johnny something priceless: normalcy. While his old associates were living dramatic lives, filled with violence and publicity, Torrio came home each evening to his wife, ate dinner, maybe read the newspaper, and went to bed. It was ordinary, domestic, and peaceful. Everything the gangster life was not. The devotion went both ways. Torrio, who had ordered men killed without hesitation, who had built brothels that used countless women, who had corrupted politicians and police, was by all accounts a faithful and devoted husband. He provided for Anna, protected her, and included her in his decision-making. When he decided to retire and leave Chicago, he talked with her. When he chose to move to Italy, she went with him. When he returned to Brooklyn, she was by his side in the violent, tricky world of organized crime, where betrayal was common and loyalty was rare. Johnny and Anna Torrio's marriage stands out as remarkably stable. They were together for over 40 years. Through poverty and wealth, through violence and peace, through imprisonment and freedom. Tuesday, April 16th, 1957, began like any other day for Johnny Torrio. He was 75 years old, long since retired from any criminal activity. Living quietly with Anna in Brooklyn, his morning routine was unremarkable. Breakfast, reading the newspaper, maybe handling some correspondence related to his real estate investments. That afternoon, Torrio decided to visit his barber shop for his regular haircut. It was the kind of ordinary errand that defined his retirement years. He told Anna he would be back soon, put on his coat and hat, and walked out of their apartment building. The barber shop was a familiar place where Torrio had been going for years. The barber knew him as a quiet, polite customer who tipped well and didn't talk much. Torrio settled into the barber's chair, the way he had hundreds of times before. Then, without warning, Johnny Torrio had a massive heart attack. He died almost instantly, slumping in the barber's chair. The barber, shocked and confused, called for an ambulance. But there was nothing to be done. Johnny Torrio, the man who had survived poverty, street gangs, black-hand extortionists, gang wars, and 5 bullets, died peacefully in a barber's chair at age 75. The death went unnoticed by the media. No newspapers ran immediate obituaries. No police investigation was started. Johnny Torrio had been so successful at keeping his anonymity in his later years that his death got no attention whatsoever. It wasn't until nearly 3 weeks later, on May 8, 1957, that newspapers finally reported his death. And even then, the coverage was relatively small. The headlines told the story. Johnny Torrio, ex-public enemy number 1, dies. The man who gave Capone his start is dead. Al Capone's tutor dies in obscurity. That last headline captured the essence of Torrio's later life perfectly. He had died in obscurity. For a man who had once controlled Chicago's huge criminal empire, who had mentored the most famous gangster in American history, who had led the creation of the national crime syndicate, dying unnoticed was perhaps the greatest achievement. Most gangsters of his time died in headlines. Machine gun attacks, shootings, police shootouts. Their deaths were dramatic, violent, and public. Johnny Torrio died the way millions of ordinary Americans died, quietly of natural causes with no fanfare. The funeral was small and private. Anna was there, along with a handful of old associates who still remembered the fox. There were no huge flower arrangements like those that had marked Big Jim Colosimo's funeral or Al Capone's funeral. There were no thousands of mourners. There was no media circus. It was a quiet service for a man who had spent the last 32 years of his life trying to be forgotten. Johnny Torrio was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn in a modest plot that reflected his desire for anonymity. The gravestone was simple, bearing only his name and dates. Nothing on it suggested this was the resting place of one of the most important figures in the history of American organized crime. In the end, what made Johnny Torrio different from his peers? Why did he survive when so many others died young? Why did he die wealthy and free when his contemporaries died in prison or in the streets? The answer lies in several key traits that define Torrio's approach to organized crime. Intelligence over violence. Torrio understood that violence was a tool, not a solution, when violence was needed, and in his world, it often was. He used it efficiently and effectively. He ordered the deaths of Black Hand extortionists, Big Jim Colosimo, Dean O'Banion, and probably others. But he never used violence for its own sake. He never killed out of anger or ego. Every death he ordered served a clear business purpose. His peers often couldn't make this distinction. Al Capone killed in anger. Dutch Schultz killed impulsively. Many gangsters used violence to show power or settle personal scores. This kind of violence was costly. It drew law enforcement attention, triggered gang wars, and made enemies for no reason. Torrio's planned approach to violence made him more effective, and strangely kept him safer, because he didn't make unnecessary enemies. Fewer people wanted him dead, because his violence served clear purposes. Those who might have been his enemies often understood his actions as business decisions rather than personal attacks. Organization over chaos. Torrio's greatest gift to organized crime was exactly what his name suggests. Organization. Before Torrio, most criminal gangs operated chaotically. Territory was taken and held through constant violence. Disputes were settled through street fights. Planning rarely went beyond the next robbery or the next shipment of illegal goods. Torrio brought organized planning to criminal business. He set up territories with clear borders. He created rules for cooperation. He built ways to settle disagreements. He thought in terms of long-term plans rather than short-term tactics. This organized approach made criminal businesses more profitable and lasting. Gang wars were costly. They cost money for gunmen and weapons. They drew police attention and they disrupted business operations. Torrio's organized approach reduced these costs while maximizing profits. Long-term thinking over short-term gains. Many of Torrio's peers focused on immediate profit. They would take any chance to make money, even if it created long-term problems. They would kill rivals to take their territory, even if it triggered gang wars. They would cheat partners if they could get away with it, even if it ruined future cooperation. Torrio thought in decades, not days. When he created the bootlegging group in Chicago, he accepted smaller short-term profits in exchange for long-term stability. When he advised the formation of the National Crime Syndicate, he was thinking about how organized crime could survive beyond prohibition. When he warned about income taxes, he was thinking about threats that were still years away from most gangsters. This long-term view meant he was often getting ready for problems before they happened. He was investing in legal businesses while other gangsters were spending wildly. He was spreading out his operations while others were putting all their resources into bootlegging. He was building political connections that would last decades while others were focused on bribing today's beat cop. Knowing when to quit. Maybe Torrio's most remarkable quality was his wisdom to retire at the peak of his power. In the underworld, bosses typically left their positions in only 3 ways. They died, they went to prison, or they were forced out. The idea of willingly walking away from wealth and power was almost unthinkable. But Torrio understood something basic. In the criminal underworld, there are no long-term winners. You can be successful, even dominant for a time. But eventually, the violence catches up to you, or the law catches up to you, or your own underlings turn on you. The longer you stay in the game, the more likely you are to end up dead or in prison. 5 bullets taught Torrio this lesson deeply. He had built an empire, but that empire came with a target on his back. No amount of planning, no amount of intelligence could completely protect him from the violence built into his world. The only way to truly escape was to leave. So he did something almost unheard of. He walked away. He handed his empire to Al Capone and retired to live a quiet life. This choice probably saved his life. If Torrio had stayed in Chicago, he almost certainly would have been killed in the gang wars of the late 1920s or imprisoned during the law enforcement crackdowns of the 1930s. Legal fronts and professional appearance. From his earliest days working with Paul Kelly, Torrio understood the importance of looking legal. He always dressed well, spoke properly, and kept legal businesses. This wasn't just about avoiding police attention, though that was certainly part of it. It was about building trust with the politicians, judges, and businessmen whose cooperation was essential to criminal success. Torrio's professional appearance made it easier for respectable people to deal with him. A well-dressed businessman offering a bribe was easier to accept than an obvious thug making threats. Torrio could meet with politicians in restaurants, do business in legal offices, and generally operate in circles where most gangsters would have been immediately uncomfortable and noticeable. This professional appearance also provided legal cover when arrested or investigated. Torrio could point to his legal businesses as his source of income. He could present himself as a respectable businessman being bothered by overeager law enforcement. While this defense didn't always work, as his eventual tax evasion conviction proved, it made prosecution harder and took more time. Those who studied organized crime professionally recognized Torrio's unique qualities. Their assessments, recorded in books, interviews, and official reports, paint a picture of a criminal genius, Elmer Irie, who led the Treasury Department's intelligence unit and was key in convicting Al Capone of tax evasion. Called Torrio the biggest gangster in America, and described him as the smartest and best of all the hoodlums. Coming from a man who had investigated every major gangster of the time, this was high praise indeed. Virgil Peterson, director of the Chicago Crime Commission, who spent decades studying Chicago organized crime, called Torrio an organizational genius, and credited him with creating the structure that would define organized crime for generations. Peterson understood that while Capone became famous, it was Torrio who had built the foundation for everything that followed. Herbert Asbury, whose book, The Gangs of Chicago, remains a classic history of Chicago crime, wrote that Torrio was unsurpassed in the annals of American crime, and called him the nearest thing to a real mastermind that this country's underworld has ever produced. Even law enforcement officials who went after Torrio couldn't help but respect his intelligence. He was different from the thugs and gunmen they usually dealt with. He was polite, well-spoken, and clearly brilliant. They might have hated what he did, but they respected how he did it. Johnny Torrio presents a deep puzzle for anyone studying his life. On one hand, he was responsible for tremendous suffering and harm. The women used in prostitution, Torrio made a big part of his early fortune from prostitution. The brothels he ran in Chicago used hundreds, probably thousands of women. Many of these women were trapped by poverty, addiction, or force. Their suffering directly paid for Torrio's wealth. This is not something that can be glossed over or made to seem less important. Those killed in gang wars, while Torrio pushed for reducing violence, he still ordered many murders. The Black Hand extortionists he had killed, Big Jim Colosimo, Dean O'Banion, and likely others, all died on his orders. More broadly, the gang wars that broke out in Chicago, even though Torrio tried to stop them, were partly a result of the criminal empire he built. Communities harmed by vice, the bootlegging, gambling, and other rackets Torrio controlled caused real harm to communities. Alcohol poisoning from badly made bootleg liquor killed people. Gambling addiction destroyed families. The corruption he spread weakened democratic institutions. The cost of corruption. Torrio corrupted police, judges, politicians, and other public officials. This corruption wasn't harmless. It meant that law enforcement resources were moved around. Justice was twisted, and public trust in institutions was damaged. The long-term harm to Chicago's political culture was deep and lasted decades after Torrio left. All of this must be admitted. Johnny Torrio was a criminal who caused real harm to real people. His intelligence and organizational skill don't change this basic fact. Yet, on the other hand, there's something truly interesting about his mind and his methods. Setting aside the right and wrong questions about what he did, the question of how he did it is genuinely interesting. Strategic thinking. Torrio's ability to think carefully about complex problems, to see chances others missed, and to plan years ahead shows a kind of intelligence that would have been valuable in any field. Organizational new ideas, the structures Torrio created for organizing criminal businesses. Territory divisions, ways to settle disagreements. Cooperative arrangements show real organizational genius. Business schools teach similar ideas for organizing legal companies. Risk management, Torrio's understanding of risk. When to take it, when to avoid it, and when to leave entirely was advanced and effective. His choice to retire rather than risk death or imprisonment shows a rare ability to look at situations without emotion and act on that view, even when it meant giving up power. Cross-cultural bridge building. At a time when ethnic loyalty was the norm, Torrio's willingness to work across ethnic lines. Marrying a Jewish woman, creating mixed ethnic criminal organizations, breaking down the walls between Italian, Jewish, and Irish gangsters, was truly new. This creates the puzzle. Johnny Torrio was a brilliant mind used for terrible purposes. His intelligence would have made him successful in legal business or politics or any number of fields. Instead, he chose crime, and his talents made him one of the most effective criminals in American history. Maybe Torrio's most lasting legacy was the organizational outline he created. A national crime syndicate he helped set up in the late 1920s and early 1930s, lasted in various forms for decades. The Commission, the idea of a governing body for organized crime, where major bosses would meet to settle disagreements and set rules, outlasted Torrio by decades. The Commission kept operating throughout the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and beyond. While its power and influence changed over time, the basic idea that organized crime benefits from organization and cooperation remained powerful. Mixed ethnic cooperation. Torrio's breaking down of ethnic walls in organized crime became standard practice. The most successful criminal organizations of later decades, like the partnership between Meyer Lansky, Jewish, and Lucky Luciano, Italian, followed the model Torrio had set up. By the 1940s and 1950s, the idea of Italian Jewish and Irish gangsters working together was common, though it had been new in Torrio's time. Territory agreements, the idea of respected territories, where each organization controlled specific areas and didn't move into others without permission, became basic to organized crime. Gang wars still happened, of course, but they were less common than they had been before. Torrio's organizational new ideas, professional standards, Torrio's stress on legal business fronts, professional appearance, and avoiding unnecessary publicity became standard operating procedure for successful organized crime figures. The most successful mobsters of later generations, like Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, followed Torrio's model of looking respectable while running criminal enterprises behind the scenes. The Chicago outfit, Torrio's specific organization in Chicago, which he handed to Al Capone, kept operating for decades after both men were gone. Through Capone, then Frank Nitti, then Tony Accardo, then Sam Giancana and others. The Chicago outfit stayed a powerful force in organized crime well into the late 20th century. While it changed over time, its basic structure and methods traced back to Torrio's new ideas in the 1920s. Torrio's influence spread to many crime families across America. The Luciano Genovese family, Lucky Luciano, who sought Torrio's advice throughout his career, built one of New York's most powerful crime families using ideas Torrio had taught him. After Luciano was imprisoned and deported, Vito Genovese took control, and the family eventually bore his name. But its structure and methods traced back to Torrio's organizational ideas. The Lansky operations, Meyer Lansky, the financial genius of the mob, kept in touch with Torrio throughout his career. Lansky's advanced approach to money laundering, legal business fronts, and political corruption showed Torrio's influence. The Chicago outfit, as already noted, this was directly Torrio's creation. Built on foundations he set up and handed to Capone, other families. While Torrio's direct influence was strongest in Chicago and New York, his organizational ideas spread to crime families across America. From Kansas City to Los Angeles, from New Orleans to Boston, organized crime groups took on the structures and methods Torrio had pioneered. This influence lasted for generations. Men who never met Torrio were running organizations built on ideas he set up. The blueprint he created, territory agreements, cooperative arrangements, legal business fronts, professional appearance, became so standard that later generations of mobsters didn't even know they were following Torrio's new ideas. They had simply become the way things were done. The most helpful comparison in understanding Johnny Torrio is with his most famous protege, Al Capone. The teacher and the student took very different paths, and their fates show basic truths about the criminal underworld. Capone wanted fame, gave interviews to reporters, and became the most famous gangster in America. His face appeared in newspapers constantly. He was recognized everywhere he went. Torrio avoided fame, refused interviews, and became so unknown that his death went unnoticed for 3 weeks. Most Americans in the 1950s had never heard of him. Capone's fame made him a target for law enforcement. Politicians couldn't appear soft on crime when the newspapers were running daily stories about Scarface Al. Torrio's anonymity allowed him to operate with much less pressure. Capone had a violent temper and often killed in anger. He personally beat men to death with baseball bats. He approved the street, Valentine's Day Massacre, one of the most brutal gang killings in history. Torrio was cold and calculating, using violence only when it served a clear business purpose. He rarely got angry and never killed on impulse. Capone's violence drew constant law enforcement attention and public anger. Torrio's planned approach reduced attention and maximized efficiency. Capone focused on ruling Chicago completely, crushing all rivals and maximizing immediate profit and power. Torrio focused on building lasting organizations, getting ready for the end of Prohibition and thinking decades ahead. Capone's empire fell apart when he went to prison. Torrio's organizational structures outlasted him by generations. Capone never thought about retirement. He held power until the federal government forcibly removed him through imprisonment. Even after his release, he tried to keep influence despite his worsening mental state. Torrio recognized when the risk outweighed the reward and willingly retired at age 43. Living another 32 years in freedom, Capone died broken and confused at 48. Torrio died peacefully in a barber's chair at 75. Final assessment: who was more successful? Capone became a household name, the most famous gangster in American history. His name is still recognized worldwide nearly 80 years after his death. But he died young, imprisoned, and mentally destroyed by disease. Torrio died in obscurity, known only to those who studied organized crime history. But he died old, free, and wealthy, with his wife by his side in the terms that matter most: survival, freedom, wealth, and long life. Torrio was far more successful and his famous student. Capone won fame, Torrio won the game. Any honest look at Johnny Torrio must deal with difficult right and wrong questions. It's tempting to focus only on his intelligence and organizational skills, treating him as a subject for intellectual study, separated from moral judgment. But that would be a mistake. The women used in Torrio's prostitution operations were real people with real suffering. Many were poor, desperate, trapped by circumstances. The brothels Torrio ran weren't fancy or agreed to. They were unfair, often abusive, and destructive to the women involved. No amount of respect for Torrio's organizational skills can change this reality. The men killed on Torrio's orders. From the Black Hand extortionists to Big Jim Colosimo to Dean O'Banion and others, all left behind families who mourned them, whatever their own crimes might have been. They were human beings whose lives Torrio ended to advance his interests. The communities harmed by bootlegging, gambling, and other rackets suffered real damage. Families destroyed by gambling addiction, people poisoned by bad alcohol, children growing up in neighborhoods controlled by violence and corruption. All of these were results of Torrio's empire. The corruption Torrio spread throughout police forces, court systems, and political institutions weakened democratic government and the rule of law. The damage lasted long after he retired. Johnny Torrio had a brilliant mind. His strategic thinking, organizational ability, and long-term planning would have made him successful in almost any field. This raises an uncomfortable question. What could he have achieved if he had used his talents for legal purposes? Could Torrio have been a successful legal businessman? Almost certainly, his organizational skills, ability to manage complex operations, and strategic thinking would have worked well in corporate management. Could he have been successful in politics? Possibly. His people skills, ability to build alliances, and understanding of how power works might have made him an effective politician. Could he have been successful in any number of other fields? Yes, the same intelligence that made him a criminal genius could have been used for almost any challenging job. This is the tragedy of Johnny Torrio, a brilliant mind used for terrible purposes. The waste of human potential is itself a form of tragedy separate from the direct harm he caused. It's also worth asking why someone like Johnny Torrio chose crime in the first place. He was born into poverty, the child of immigrants in a society that offered few chances to people like him. The legal economy in the early 1900s was run by Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans who treated Italian immigrants badly. This doesn't excuse Torrio's choices. Plenty of Italian immigrants faced the same disadvantages and chose honest work, but it provides background. Organized crime offered chances for wealth and power that the legal economy mostly denied to Italian immigrants. Similarly, Prohibition created the chance that allowed Torrio to build his empire. The choice to make alcohol illegal, a product millions of Americans wanted, created a huge illegal market. Torrio didn't create that market. He simply organized and used it more effectively than others. Again, this doesn't excuse his actions, but it raises questions about the larger factors that create conditions where organized crime can grow. The final lesson of Johnny Torrio's life is maybe his most important. He understood that in the criminal underworld, the only way to truly win is to eventually stop playing. Every other major gangster of his time proved this lesson by counterexample. Al Capone held on to power until he was forcibly removed by imprisonment, then died young and broken. Lucky Luciano held on to power until he was imprisoned and deported. Never able to return to America, Dutch Schultz kept pushing limits until the commission ordered his death. Bugsy Siegel kept taking risks until he was murdered. The pattern is clear. Gangsters who stay in the game eventually lose. The violence catches up to them, or the law catches up to them, or their own organization turns on them. The longer you play, the more certain your eventual loss becomes. Johnny Torrio understood this earlier than his peers. 5 bullets taught him a lesson that other gangsters never learned. No amount of wealth or power is worth losing your life or freedom. Success in the underworld isn't measured by how much power you gather, but by whether you survive to enjoy the results of that power. So Torrio did something extreme. He quit. He walked away from millions of dollars and tremendous power. He retired at 43, an age when most men are just hitting their professional stride. And by doing so, he won. He lived to 75. He died free. He kept his wealth. He stayed with his wife. He avoided the violence that claimed his peers. In every meaningful way, Johnny Torrio beat the game by refusing to keep playing it today. More than 60 years after Johnny Torrio's death, his influence still echoes through organized crime. The idea of organized criminal syndicates with territory agreements and cooperative arrangements remains standard. The stress on legal business fronts and professional appearance continues. The understanding that violence should serve business purposes rather than ego remains powerful among successful criminals. Law enforcement has also learned from Torrio's legacy. Modern organized crime investigations focus on financial crimes like money laundering and tax evasion. The very weaknesses Torrio warned his associates about in the 1920s, the RICO Act, passed in 1970, was designed specifically to fight the kind of organized criminal businesses Torrio helped create. In popular culture, Torrio remains mostly forgotten, while Capone remains famous. There have been dozens of movies about Al Capone, but few that even mention Johnny Torrio when he does appear, such as in the TV series Boardwalk Empire. He's usually shown as a supporting character to Capone's main role. His obscurity would have pleased Torrio. He never wanted fame. He wanted wealth, power, and most importantly, to survive. In death as in life, he got what he wanted: to be forgotten by the general public, while being remembered and respected by those who study organized crime seriously. Who was Johnny Torrio really? Beneath the legend of the Fox, he was a small man barely 5'12", who built an empire through intelligence rather than physical intimidation. He was quiet but commanding. He was harsh in business, but devoted to his wife. He could order murders without hesitation, but rarely raised his voice in anger. He was a man of opposites, pushing for peace while practicing violence, preaching organization while running illegal businesses, keeping a respectable appearance while controlling brothels and bootlegging operations. He was also by all accounts truly intelligent. Not just street smart, though he was certainly that, but intellectually sharp. He read books. He thought strategically. He planned years ahead. He understood human psychology and organizational dynamics. In a different time or place with different chances, he might have been a successful general, CEO, or political leader, but he was born into poverty as the son of Italian immigrants in an era when such people had limited legal chances. He entered the criminal world as a teenager and found he had a talent for it. And once in that world, he had the intelligence to see it clearly. The violence, the betrayals, the unavoidable bad endings. And eventually, he had the wisdom to leave it. The story of Johnny Torrio is ultimately a story about intelligence, organization, violence, and survival. It's a story about how a small Italian immigrant boy became one of the most powerful criminals in American history. It's a story about how empires are built and how wise men know when to leave them. It's also a warning about wasted potential and the human cost of organized crime. All of Torrio's intelligence, all of his organizational genius, all of his strategic brilliance, it was all used for businesses that caused tremendous harm. The women used, the men killed, the communities corrupted, the institutions weakened. This was the price of Torrio's empire. But it's also a story about understanding risk and knowing when to quit. In a world where his peers almost all died young or went to prison, Torrio lived to old age and freedom. He did this not through luck, but through calculated decision-making and the wisdom to recognize when the game was no longer worth playing. Maybe that's the final puzzle of Johnny Torrio. His greatest success came not from what he built, but from what he walked away from. The empire he created lived on after him. But he himself lived on because he left the empire behind. In the barber's chair in Brooklyn, on that April day in 1957, Johnny Torrio died the way he had lived his later years, quietly, peacefully, without fuss. The violent streets of Chicago and New York were far behind him. The gang wars, the bootlegging, the murders, all of it was in the past. He had been many things: gangster, bootlegger, murderer, organizer, strategist, mentor, husband, but in the end, he was also the one thing most of his peers never managed to be: a survivor. The fox had outsmarted them all, not by being the strongest, or the most violent, or the most famous, but by being the smartest, and by knowing that sometimes the smartest move is to walk away. As the sun set on Johnny Torrio's life in that Brooklyn barbershop, it also set on an era. The world of organized crime he had helped create continued without him, but it would never again see anyone quite like the fox, the genius who built an empire, survived 5 bullets, retired with wealth intact, and died peacefully at 75 in a business where almost everyone loses. Johnny Torrio found a way to win, not by conquering, but by surviving. Not by seeking glory, but by accepting obscurity. Not by fighting until the end, but by knowing when to stop fighting. That maybe more than anything else was the true genius of Johnny Torrio. In a world of violence and early graves, he alone understood the most important lesson. The only way to beat the game is to know when to stop playing it. If Johnny Torrio's amazing life story fascinated you tonight, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of his story surprised you the most? Was it his intelligence? His ability to walk away? The fact that he died peacefully when so many of his peers died violently? If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating but lesser-known criminal masterminds, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. And if you haven't already subscribed, click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have many more incredible true crime stories coming your way, perfect for those late-night listening sessions. Share this video with anyone you know who loves true crime history, organized crime stories, or just fascinating biographical tales. The story of Johnny Torrio deserves to be more widely known. Until next time, this has been the story of the Fox, the smartest gangster America ever knew. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.